Today's ancient witness comes from Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. One Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. There was a woman there for 18 years, had sickness caused by a spirit. She was bent double, quite incapable of standing up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are free of your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and immediately she stood up straight and began thanking God. The head of the synagogue, indignant that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the congregation, "There are 6 days for working. Come on those days to be healed, not on the Sabbath." Jesus said in reply, "You hypocrites! Which of you doesn't let your ox or your donkey out of the stall on the Sabbath to water it? This daughter of Sarah and Abraham has been in the bondage of Satan for 18 years. Shouldn't she have been released from her shackles on the Sabbath?" At these words, Jesus' opponents were humiliated. Meanwhile, everyone else rejoiced at the marvels Jesus was accomplishing.
I once had a pair of gray corduroy pants when I was growing up. I love those pants. They were much warmer in the winter than standard denim jeans, and I liked the way the lines moved up the fabric. They always seemed to make me look tall when I wore them, as if I need any help. It wasn't all good though. I didn't love that swishing sound they made when I walked. It happened as I walked down the hallways and in the classrooms, and seemed to come from the friction of the inner seams. I think I remember investigating that once. I don't know if it was because they may have been a little baggy and that's why they were crossing, or if my legs were just too close together when I walked, but either way, they made that swooshing sound and I felt insecure about that when I wore them. I felt insecure about a lot of things growing up, still do in fact, but back then I felt insecure, particularly when meeting new people and new friends. And I always dreaded that first day of school. That was one of my insecurities as well. My mom would usually take me when I was in elementary school. We had like a 15 or 20-minute drive to school, and we would pull up in that horseshoe drive and she would park the car. I would get out and she would come around to take my hand, and she would escort me down the hallway as we made our way to the classroom. And when we finally got to the room, she would crouch down low and say, "I love you, Michael, and you're gonna do fine, and you're gonna meet lots of new people and make lots of new friends." And I would say, "I love you back." But as soon as I turned around and entered that room, the anxiety would set back in. And I think it's safe to say that everyone feels anxious every once in a while. I think I can say that. You know, the feeling, the dry mouth, the sweaty palms, the pounding heart. And I'm sure no one likes that. So it was important for me to be welcomed by my teacher and to know that I was indeed in a safe space. Still true, I think, for me. And researchers say that feeling anxious about a new experience is normal for most people. But finding the courage to face those circumstances, that can be a different story altogether. And the funny thing is, I thought I was flawed or lacking And I thought that my being nervous back then, my being nervous was unique to me. Well, today's ancient witness details one of the Sabbath stories in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is teaching in a synagogue and arguing with other Jewish leaders about the essence of practices around keeping Sabbath. And not for the first time either. Jesus has had a history of confronting leadership on issues related to justice for all. And by this point, he's grown frustrated with religious leaders that are prioritizing worship over justice. And so in the Gospel of Luke, one of the key ideas in that gospel, a take-home message, if you will, is that the good news that Jesus brings is not limited to those at the center of society, but it is open to everyone. As a rabbi and a reformer, Jesus is especially concerned with protecting religious life from abuse and distortion. In fact, he tends to point out that religious practices are best to be thought of as not ends in themselves or standards people must meet, but instead to think of religious practices as a means of helping to foster healthy and vibrant forms of life. Now, the Sabbath, traditionally speaking, was a day of rest. And so when Jesus is confronted with a criticism, he responds with a little bit of sarcasm to this leader when he says, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? Is it okay to save a life or to destroy it?" And the point Jesus is driving at is not whether to keep the Sabbath, but how to keep the Sabbath. And more to the point, what it means to keep that day holy to God. The traditional viewpoint in the world behind the text is that the Sabbath was intended as a day of rest, meaning no work can be done on this day unless it involves saving a life. And so when Jesus spots a woman sitting in the midst of the people, he calls her over to where he is. He will use this as a demonstration, but she is no ordinary woman. According to Luke, this woman was bent double or bent over and quite unable to stand up straight for about half of her adult life. And given the short life expectancy of women in the first century. And this particular word phrase described a condition in which this person's spine was curved so much that she was unable to straighten up. Her weakness itself is described as the power to hold her captive to restrictive movement and to the inability to meet another person face to face. As one interpreter describes it, she is limited to a world defined by the pieces of ground around her own toes. So if we take a moment to imagine this, being this woman, we might see that for almost 20 years, she has been restricted by some unexplained medical issue. It has been extremely impactful in her daily life because she cannot stand up straight, which is something people are expected to be able to do. She hasn't been able to find the energy to attend the girls' nights or the brunches or even the occasional wedding. It is just something she hasn't had the energy to do for almost 2 decades. And going further, her workplace may not have made accommodations for her. And as a result of all that, she has found herself dependent on charity organizations and the occasional mutual aid fund. And I think we would agree that none of that is sustainable. It's also possible that this woman has spent several vacations worth of savings on healers and doctors and holistic treatments. Such was very common in the world of Greek culture. But for this woman in particular, all was to no avail. But she was a daughter of Sarah. And Sarah was the one whom God promised a world of abundance, even though she was well past her childbearing years. So Jesus here confronts leadership to say that this particular woman, even though she appeared to others as non-normative, as small and unimportant, and thus relegated to the margins of society, that she is still belonging in the promises of God. And if she was a daughter of Sarah, then she was indeed a daughter and child of God. So Jesus reasons that if it is inappropriate to untie farm animals on the Sabbath, then it is much more appropriate to untie a daughter of Sarah and Abraham. And when Jesus recognizes this woman as a child of God, he in effect brings her from the margins to the heart of the people. And he goes on to tell them that her restoration and praise will spread like a wildfire beyond all expectations, which is not unlike a tiny seed planted in the soil. This, Jesus says, is what makes the Sabbath holy as a day. And for Jesus, justice work is an act of praising God, just as important as worship. And Jesus' message is not that it was simply okay to heal on the Sabbath, but that it was indeed necessary. In the way that it was necessary to save an animal from suffering by leading them to water, it is even more necessary to save a person from suffering as well. The God of Jesus is a God who is praised through every act of mercy and liberation and inclusion. Jesus says God's reign is like that the kingdom of God is like a seed, or in this case, an ailing woman restored to belonging, an act whose praise soon spreads to all in the congregation and beyond. So, beloveds, the good news of the gospel is that every act of welcoming all into inclusive spaces of love is indeed an act of worship. And God's reign is like a world of belonging. And facing something unknown or facing something we think might be difficult, like walking into a classroom for the first time, we can draw on our courage. Maya Angelou said that, quote, one isn't necessarily born with courage, but one is born with potential. And without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. We can't be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest, unquote, without courage. So it was with Jesus. So it was with the woman in the story, and so it can be with us. So, as a means of helping us with a little courage, I reached out to some anxious students for advice about how to approach the new school year. They may indeed be the best source. A third grader named Ziva said that school days can feel like they last forever. She recommends eating your whole lunch and enjoying recess to the fullest to help with that feeling. A sixth grader named Levi said, "Be sure and write neatly, or you will have to redo your work." And no one wants to do that. A seventh grader named Sophia says that friendships go a long way. She goes so far as to organize and label her supplies by class and make sure she has a clean, quiet study space. And she adds that a positive attitude with an open mind will help with all classes. And lastly, Selvum, an 11th grader, says getting a good night's sleep, making sure all school supplies are packed, and always being eager to help with, always being eager to learn will all help with having a successful school year. He says having an open mind also is help. And he adds that no matter how difficult or lonely it gets, try to make the most of it. And that's great advice for life, I think. Well, God grants us the strength to meet life's challenges with a love from within. And God, my friends, will meet us in any place where peace and justice will meet. Praise be to God. Amen.